coming up on Outrun Week. Subscribe today. Holy what's up? Hey, how you doing? Ben Scarborough, Scarflix. Nice to meet you. Like and subscribe. Oh yeah, Outrun Week, you guys saw that? Hell yeah, that video took forever to make. I know what you're thinking, right? You want to play Outrun. Just pull out your 3DS and download that shit. It's like $5. Oh, you guys don't have 3DSs? Well, you know, the next time you're in Atlanta, stop by the studio. I got the Sega Saturn port, man. We can play that shit, man. Stop by. Oh, you guys don't live in Atlanta? I guess you guys don't want to emulate the Sega Saturn version, do you? Well, you guys have a PC, right?
First time I played Outrun, I crashed and like 2 people flew out of my car. I mean, I don't think that's how you play the game, but maybe I just suck.
Wouldn't it be awesome to just click this nice car icon and then what? Oh my god, Outrun's so fast! Wait a minute, stop. What did I just do? It's called Cannonball. It's an Outrun engine that allows you to play an enhanced version of Outrun on a ton of different platforms. It's not an emulator, it's literally a complete rewrite of the original game into portable C++ code. Whoa, I didn't lose you, did I? Look, I'll make it easy. The links for all the files you'll need are in the video description. You're welcome. Unzip the app, place some ROMs in this folder here, and boom, okay? Major key. The time in your life of not having access to Outrun on whatever computer you want is over. Things just got interesting. Right, look, this is awesome. You can start from wherever in the game you want. Mad features, yo. Turns out one guy developed this entire thing. Chris White wrote about his Cannonball development process for years on his blog Reassembler, and he might go down in history as the biggest Outrun fan ever. This legend ported compiled arcade ROMs into C++ and made Outrun portable. The dream realized. Outrun on everything. If he lived down the street, I'd invite him over for a game of Cisco Heat, but Chris lives in Europe, so a simple phone call would have to do.
I started to ask myself tons of questions about the project. Questions like, who is Chris White? He's clearly an individual with a lot of love for Outrun. Enough love to dive into the code and port the entire thing over to C++. Rather than lose any more sleep over what kind of genius decided to embark on such a labor of love, I decided to reach out to Chris personally. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, Chris White.
Hello, hi there.
All right, welcome to the show.
Okay, great, yeah, thanks for having me on. Good to be here, good to meet you.
First, I want to go back in time a little bit. My research informed me that Outrun is extremely popular in Europe.
Yeah, hugely popular game. I mean, I don't know if it's more popular in Europe than the US, if it just had better distribution, but it was like, I don't know, the cab goes for a lot more money in the UK than the US, for example, and it's probably a reflection of, you know, the popularity of the game over here in Europe.
What's your earliest memory of Outrun?
Yeah, so that's an easy one. So I got taken away when I was about probably 7 years old to a holiday, sort of a British holiday camp by my parents on the sea. And, you know, back then in the 80s, you know, they had huge arcades at these things. And at the time, you know, I had my ZX Spectrum computer, which was like a very basic but popular computer here in the UK. And I remember going into this arcade with my dad. Obviously, you know, back then, a lot of the arcades, this was 87 or so, they still had a lot of old games in them. You know, you could still find black and white games, you know, because it's easy to think that, 87, you know, everything was new, but they still had a lot of old games in them. So I was, you know, walking around looking at all the games, and I remember sort of seeing this upright Outrun cabinet there with some people playing it, and I just looked at it, I was like, what is this? This is insane. I've never seen anything like this before. And I just stood transfixed, you know, looking at this machine and watching people play it. And it just blew my mind. I was like, I did not realize a computer game could be like that. It was just a real eye opener. You know, the combination of the graphics, which at the time were just out of this world in terms of, you know, the sprite scaling, the detail, the music pumping out, the speed at which the thing was running. You know, as a 7-year-old kid, as I was at the time, I mean, it was just like, it was a life-changing moment for me. I was just like, wow, this is what a computer game could really be like. And before then, I was there playing my super basic stuff at home. It loaded off a cassette tape. So from that moment on, every time I went to an arcade, I would try and play Outrun. I'd try and find it. I'd try and play it. And shortly after that, I got the home conversion for the ZX Spectrum. And this is a computer with 48K of memory and 8 colors. It wasn't a good machine. And the conversion, they tried their best, but it was really, really poor. So I always then had this dream as a kid of like just being able to play the arcade version. I was like, as a kid, I was like, one day I'm gonna buy that machine, and one day I'm gonna have that at home. So it took a while to get there, but that was my earliest memory of Outrun.
Besides Cannonball, of course, do you have a favorite home conversion or console port of Outrun?
I mean, the best console port is the Sega Saturn port. And that didn't come out till 1996. So, probably the best one back in the day, I'd say, was the PC Engine conversion. That was pretty cool, nicely done. The palette was pretty good. But in all honesty, all the conversions suck. And when you see all the sort of like YouTube videos about Let's Play Outrun or whatever, they go through like 20 tedious conversions, and it's just kind of like, why are you doing this? They're all rubbish. Just forget.
Yeah.
You've got main now. You've got really good conversions now. You just go and play one of them. Don't bother with going back and playing the Amstrad CPC version or something like that. So I mean, the arcade version's where it's at for me. The Saturn version's great. The Sega Saturn hardware was kind of an evolution of the line of arcade hardware that Sega were making. So Robutu, I think they were called, who ported the game to that. I believe it's like a direct port from the original source code, so it is arcade perfect in many ways. There's a couple of differences, but not many. And obviously the recent 3DS version that came out as well by M2, that's also really fantastic. And if you've got a Game Boy, a 3DS, go out and buy a copy, because you'll get to play Outrun in 3D. Awesome.
Before the Cannonball project started, did you have any experience with porting other games to C++?
Yeah, so I mean, when I graduated from uni, I did a computer science degree, and then I went into games programming. But I went into like mobile phone games, and back then we're not talking iPhones, we're talking 2-color black and white handsets with 64K file size. So it's kind of like programming for the Spectrum, almost, that computer I had when I was a kid. So we're making really, really basic games, and over time the hardware got a little bit better. We got color and that sort of thing. It was all Java based. And yeah, I was doing a number of things. I was doing original games, I was porting old console games, and one of the games that I got to port was one of my favorite games from childhood. I don't know if you remember the Bitmap brothers. They made Xenon 2, Speedball 2, Chaos Engine.
Must have missed that.
Yeah, so they were a UK developer, and they were very popular over here. And anyway, there was a game called Speedball 2, which was kind of like their take on the film Rollerball, when it's a futuristic sports game. So they came in, and I met Mike Montgomery, who was one of the Bitmap brothers, and I said to him, like, I really want to, it'd be great. I'm really pleased to be working on this game, but can you get me the original source code from the Mega Drive or Genesis version? And he was like, sure, so I got the source code for that version. And at that point I was like, I don't want to do this game a disservice. I don't want to do my interpretation of this game. I want to port it directly. So, I bought a second-hand 68,000 assembler programming manual, and then just converted the code line by line and sort of compared what I was doing with what was going on in the Sega Genesis emulator, and compared it frame by frame and ported it that way. So that was the first sort of conversion I did from assembler into a modern language. And
nice.
It was easy though, because I got given the source code. It was all nicely commented. It was very clean. So the project took a few months, and it was I was getting it was a job, but it was kind of like a hobby at the same time. So it's a cool thing to do.
It's been my experience as a programmer that developers are always like up against the clock, right? There's always a timeline or a crunch that teams have to, or they're working up against to complete a project. You didn't really have a deadline, right? You just kind of worked on Cannonball when you could.
Yeah. So Cannonball came a few years later, and I was sort of like, I was always, I remained fascinated with Outrun. I bought the arcade machine in the late 90s, much to my parents' annoyance, the one you can see behind me, although I've restored it since then. I read everything I could about Sega and their development, and I wanted to find out more about the team that made the game, and just a bit of background about what was going on inside their heads when they came up with it. And I kind of came to the conclusion that I was not going to find out any more information about this game, and the only way to really find out more was to dismantle the code of the game, and get inside it and look at it line by line and try and get inside the heads of the people who are making the game, and
Sure.
insight into the development process. So it's probably that, I don't know, it's 2008, 2009 that I started poking around and trying to decompile the code. And I just started very casually at first, trying to understand small pieces of it. I think I started by looking for the code at just printed text to the screen, and trying to find that as an entry point into understanding the code base. And as time went by, I kind of got better and better at sort of disassembling this big puzzle. It was a big puzzle. You don't know what anything does, what any memory address is for, what any line of means at first. And I slowly went through, and over a long period of time, I think it was years and years, I slowly went through and commented all the code. This was before I had kids and stuff, so I had a lot more time.
Oh, okay.
a lot of time on my hands in the evening, so it was kind of like this endless puzzle that I got really, really absorbed in. I almost got addicted to doing it. It became more and more fascinating as I unraveled more of the secrets. So, and as you look through more of the code base, you just find out more and more interesting stuff that wouldn't be there on the surface from playing the game.
Did you have any idea how long Cannonball would take to develop?
Well, I didn't even start by thinking I'm going to make Cannonball. I started by just thinking I want to understand every single line of the OutRun source code and comment it. Before Cannonball, actually, I was decompiling the source code, and a guy, an American guy called Darren, who bizarrely I'd worked with on a Dreamcast project like back in 2001. He kind of he wrote to me because he saw my blog and what I was doing. He was like, "Oh yeah, I kind of want to make some modifications to the original code to run on the machine. I want to do a free play mode. I want to do high score saving on the arcade cab." And I was like, "Well, good news, because I've got a lot of the code decompiled." So as this sort of halfway project, we then started making a thing called OutRun Enhanced, which was a set of ROMs that you could run on the arcade cab, where we fixed some of the bugs in the code and things that I came across. So this is the first step. But then after, once everything in the game was totally decompiled, then Cannonball started. And then I was like, right, I'm going to, brush up my C++ skills. So then recoding it. Did I know how long it would take? I mean, I knew it would be a long time. I tried not to think about it, because I think it's kind of like you've got to enjoy the journey with a project like this. If you think about the destination too much, you give up. It's just too much work. It would be too long. It was a difficult project. I mean, a lot of nights I was up till 2 a.m, whatever, 3 a.m, just coding, couldn't stop, just trying to get this thing done and finished and fix all the bugs and everything. I mean, it was a huge effort, and it's one I could never do again now. I don't have the free time. If you were to ask me to do this again for another game, it's just not going to happen. It's a once in a lifetime thing, I think.
Looking at your GitHub repository for Cannonball, it looks like a majority of the commits were in like 2013, 2014.
Yeah.
What were some of the earliest lines of code like for Cannonball? Like what features did you build first that you wanted to?
So the first thing I did actually with Cannonball was like when I started decompiling the game and I was doing the text, I kind of started by just rendering text, and I just got the main sort of like attract mode loop working, but only with the text routine. So it was just flashing insert coin and displaying the sort of logos and stuff below on the screens. Yeah, I just started that way, and I used kind of some of the main code as a guidance for like how you render to screen and how the hardware worked. But then I used my own like converted code to sort of plug into that. So rather than it running through a CPU emulator, it was like rewritten in C++. So that's how I started. The start's kind of boring, really, because you've got not a lot to show for what you're doing, but as an entry point into the project is really important, because that's the first moment you have something coming up on screen.
After reading your blog, it's pretty safe to assume that you've messed around with the code of other AM2 games of the generation, like Space Harrier, Afterburner, Hang On.
Yeah.
Did you notice any code reuse between the engines of those and OutRun?
Yeah, there is. I mean, like OutRun is kind of built on top of some of the Space Harrier code base. Like, for example, you can spot similarities in the code, so they clearly reuse code. In fact, even things like the random number routine in OutRun is still carried through to Sonic the Hedgehog on on the Sega Genesis, they used the same seed for the random number generator and things like that. So clearly within Sega, between a lot of the departments, they were, using code. But for example, Super Hang-On, a lot of the road generation code is very similar to Outrun. Outrun itself contains like a couple of the Space Harrier. One of the Space Harrier fonts is still in there in the tile set unused. It contains one of the Space Harrier sound samples in the PCM sort of sample ROMs. So yeah, there's a lot of code reuse between the projects, but a lot of custom stuff as well.
The ROMs of Outrun don't just contain game engine data, right? Like there's a lot of stuff in there that controls the actual movement of like the hydraulics of the arcade cabinet itself, like force feedback.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's actually not a force feedback cabinet, but it's sort of a motion cabinet with motors that move it left and right. So yeah, it contains all of that code as well, and I hooked that up to sort of a force feedback wheel you could plug into the PC. So I use that code as a way of like giving you force feedback.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you can kind of play the game, and it actually uses the motion controls to give you a sense of force feedback when you play on the PC. Of course, I've only ever tested it with one wheel, which was like a Logitech one. I don't know how well it works on a lot of other ones, but yeah, the code's there and it kind of works. It's cool to play. It actually feels better than the arcade game, to be honest.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering if it was difficult to implement the force feedback to work with modern USB wheels. So that's pretty enlightening. I was thinking, I was wondering if that was there. Now, this is coming from somebody that has yet to play an Outrun arcade cabinet.
Oh wow! Okay, yeah, you should see. I don't know if you've seen, there are some guys who do like full motion cabinets, and they ported Cannonball to a full hydraulic cabinet with movement, like a modern one. I think they're like thousands of pounds, these cabinets, but it be fantastic. It's there's a link to it off my blog, and when you see it ported to a machine like that, it's like, this is the ultimate way to play Outrun. Unfortunately, I don't have the space or money to buy one of them myself, but it was an amazing use of the code base. And one nice thing about the fact that the code is out there and it's on GitHub, people can take it and use it for a lot of cool other projects.
Can you explain to all of us what Alex Bartholomew's Outrun software development kit is all about?
Yeah, so that's something a bit different actually. Alex's kit is it's a C and C++ based SDK that compiles code that you can actually run on the original hardware. So if you wanted to code a new game to run on Outrun hardware, you could code it in C, then compile it with his set of libraries, and then run your own code on the Outrun arcade hardware. And he's got sort of like a really nifty development board as well, so you can easily pipe code into the arcade hardware without having to even program a new EEPROM. So actually, Alex is based in the Netherlands, and I met up with him when I was out there relatively recently on a stag do, and had lunch with him, kind of thing. So I've actually met him in real life as well. So yeah, he's a cool guy. He's a programmer by trade as well. Very intelligent guy, and I think he's got an Outrun Deluxe sit-down cabinet as well. So he's a big Outrun fan too.
Okay, I want to talk about layout for a second. This is how I know I'm talking to a true wizard here, guys. Chris wrote a level editor for Cannonball so you can make your own Outrun levels, right?
Yeah, that's right.
How did you get the idea for this?
Well, it was always something I wanted to do, actually. I just kind of thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool to create a new track? And also, I kind of like the idea of being able to just visualize the Outrun tracks anyway. See, just print out sort of the curvature of the track, kind of scroll through the level, take a look through it, and all that kind of thing. So that was the next project, and layout was kind of really tough, because I'm not entirely sure how they built the original levels on Outrun, but I'm pretty sure it was quite, for example, the music on Outrun, they transcribed everything completely manually into ROM. They worked it out on a keyboard and then did it all manually. And similarly with the Outrun level data, there's a lot of odd values in there that are kind of actually wrong. You don't see them when you're playing the game, but it's almost like someone's done this data by and they haven't typed in the values correctly. And you start noticing this when you put it through an editor like mine automates the creation of some of these values. You're like, why is that value wrong? So anyway, building an editor to create Outrun tracks when I don't think they were made with a nice, easy to use editor like that in the first place was kind of a big challenge, because there were so many oddities with the level editing structure in Outrun that I had to get around. But it works. You can use it with Cannonball. Technically, I could extend it at some point and make it so you can actually create tracks for the original game. And I'd like to go back and make a whole new set of levels for Outrun. and play them on the original hardware. But there's obviously some limitations with that in terms of the size of the file structure and stuff and what you can fit in the ROMs. So you'd be a bit more limited. But yeah, I mean, you can go and you can create levels, you can change the track direction, you can change the scenery. You can't change the sprites themselves. You have to use the ones that are already there. But it's a pretty powerful tool. It's a very complicated tool, to be honest. I mean, I made it as simple as possible to use, but yeah, you can do an awful lot with it. You can change all the road heights and define your own new height patterns. So yeah, it's the full works. I just wanted, I wanted to understand exactly how the levels worked in Outrun. So yeah, that's how I went ahead and did that. It's, yeah, when I think back to some of the problems that I had to solve, and like I had to sort of try and reverse engineer a lot of the algorithms they used to generate the road. And that was really difficult. I spent nights just with spreadsheets open, putting in different values, trying to get the right thing out. And yeah, there's a lot of head scratching involved. A lot of this work, sometimes you have days and days where you don't make any breakthroughs, and you just got to keep persevering and not give up.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was possible to take the tracks from layout and use the SDK that Alex wrote to try and get them back on the original board, but I guess that's not a thing.
Not really a thing. I mean, it would be easier, to be honest, for me just to change the layout to output the tracks to go back into the original ROMs. The thing is, it's very easy, to break the original engine. For example, there's things like a limitation on the number of sprites that you can display on screen at any one time. And if you use the editor and just exceed that somehow, then the original engine just bombs out and totally crashes. So okay. It's kind of like, even with a nice GUI to make these tracks, you still have to be a little bit technically minded and know what's going on. So, some people have used the editor and I've seen the tracks they've made, but it's not been as popular, I'd say, as Cannonball, because Cannonball's kind of plug and play, relatively speaking, whereas the track editor, you need to get to grips with it and know what you're doing. So I kind of built that really more as a project for my own interest, really. But yeah, it's there if you want to take it. The source code's there.
So having said all of that, what did you perceive to be the most difficult thing about the entire Cannonball development process?
The most difficult thing, I think, sometimes was finding and resolving bugs. What I'd do, I'd have the MAME emulator running in one window and I have Cannonball running in another window, and I'd advance them frame by frame, and I'd have the MAME debugger open, I'd have the Visual Studio debugger open, I'd have IDA Dissembler open, so I'd have all these windows just open, and I'd just be running through frame by frame, and I'd be like, where does this one value in the code go wrong? And it's because there's a bug, and the bug can manifest itself a few minutes, well, not minutes, probably a few seconds after the actual code goes wrong. You might not see it for a while. So you're there looking at all these variables with theories about what could be going wrong, trying to figure out where the error is. And it's insanely difficult, because the thing is, MAME doesn't perfectly reproduce Outrun anyway, because the way they interleave the two main CPUs, the two 6800s, one runs the road rendering code, the other one runs a lot of the other game logic. The way they interleave them on MAME is not the same as the arcade hardware. They take some shortcuts for speed purposes, or they did, at least in the version back when I was doing it. I don't know if they've updated it since. So actually, the way in which stuff spawns in MAME, like some of the cars and things like that, isn't arcade perfect. I mean, you're not really going to notice it, but the way I did it was very different again, because in Cannonball, I kind of did a lockstep thing where it was sort of update the road code, update the rest of the code, and it made perfect sense for the way I was doing it, because you wouldn't interleave the two threads. It would be really weird. So there's a lot of complexity with figuring out bugs in road rendering and stuff like that. I mean, the road rendering code in Outrun is a nightmare. I don't know if it was C code that was compiled to assembler, but the style of coding is hot. It's just a mess. I mean, compared with a lot of the main CPU code, where you look through and you think, oh, this is logical, I can understand what the programmer was thinking. With the road rendering code, it's just mind blown. That was really hard.
One of the most fascinating things to me about Outrun is the rolling start bug and the gear gotcha exploit.
Yeah.
I have been hell-bent on trying to understand what this bug is, but almost all the information outside of YouTube and your blog is in Japanese. A lot of the information doesn't translate well, and I'm working on putting together like a definitive guide for speedrunners on how to pull this tactic off. Can you shed a little light on this for us?
Like technically, or just how you do it?
I've pretty much got down to how to trigger the bug, but technically, like, do you know what's going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially a bug whereby sort of the speed isn't properly checked when you're shifting gears. So you can end up in a situation where you just can drive off road at like 294 kilometers an hour, which is 1 kilometer an hour faster than you can go in OutRun anyway. And it's just it's basically just tripping up the engine with rapid gear changes, so it gets in a bit of a strange state. So yeah, I mean, if you watch like YouTube, there are some Japanese videos that basically gear gacha the whole way through the game, taking interesting paths through the scenery and all that sort of thing. In fact, back in Japan in the 80s, there was even a Laserdisc released which featured the gear gacha bug. I've got it up there somewhere. And that showed players how to do it. And there was a magazine in Japan as well. I think it was Gamest or Gamest, however you say it. And they had big page-by-page guides showing how you did this technique. But I think this technique was only known in Japan. I don't think any European players ever used it. I might be wrong. I'd never heard of this in Europe. In fact, still a lot of European players don't know about it now. But when you see the Japanese players doing it, it's like it's a totally different way of playing the game. Like, is it cheating? Is it valid? Who really knows? Although, like, the fact that you just play the whole game by driving through the scenery and taking these new paths, I mean, that's like taking things to another level. It's really awesome. So yeah.
Have you been able to pull this off on original arcade hardware?
I can do it a little bit. Like I don't do. I mean, I don't want to break my gear stick.
Right.
Pulling the gear stick backwards and forwards. So. I've given it a bit of a go, but I'm not the best OutRun player in the world, you know, by any stretch of the imagination. I've got a lot of friends who are better at OutRun than me, believe it or not. I've never been the world's best game player. I'm not the one that's going for the high score. I'm more interested in the tech behind the game, how it all works, and the development process, if that makes sense.
The Sega Saturn port was the first time that we all got to experience OutRun at 60 frames a second, right?
Yeah, although kind of a weird 60 frames a second. I don't know quite what's going on with the Saturn port. It doesn't feel right. It feels like you're going too slowly when you put it to 60 FPS mode.
I know when users were trying to hack the original Dark Souls for PC, like speeding up the game to double the frame rate caused bugs and like threw the physics all out of whack in the game engine. You know, like what were some of the challenges that you faced when you were trying to pull off that 60 frames a second for Cannonball?
Well, yeah, I mean, it actually wasn't too bad going to 60 frames a second. I've got to think back to sort of how I didn't. I mean, like I didn't end up with any of the strange side effects that I on the Saturn version, so I don't know quite what they were doing. I think from memory, yeah, there was so a lot of the game was very hard coded. Like the original OutRun actually runs at 60 frames a second, but some bits of the game run at 30. So, for example, like the tile map in the background that scrolls at 60. The road updates at 30 because the board just wasn't fast enough to handle doing 60. So a lot of stuff's hard coded to run at 30. So you then have to go through all the places in the code and find where they've done something that assumes the game's running at 30. So like some of the collision and things like that, and when to cull the sprites and things. I think I had to go through and change a lot of that stuff from memory. Yeah, but it was a cool thing to do. It didn't take that long, to be honest, getting the game running at 60 frames a second, nor did it take that long getting it running in widescreen. Like, maybe that was a day's work and then a couple of days of tweaking and bug fixing to make it work. And Cannonball was the first time OutRun had ever run in widescreen, because the 3DS version's done it since. Yeah, I got there first.
So now that Cannonball is out in the wild, I'm sure you've seen some pretty interesting projects that fans have come up with using your code, right? Like, what are some of those things?
Yeah, there was the hydraulic engine I mentioned earlier. That's my favorite one because it's just like completely ridiculous. And my goal with Cannonball was always like, it's not really meant to be run on like old hardware. It was a way of preserving OutRun for future generations. You know, I wanted modern machines to be able to run it. I want the code base there so people can port it. So there's the hydraulic thing. Someone ported it to, I think it's like, there's a Raspberry Pi port, which is then used in this tiny little car toy called it's like a Tomy toy, which is like a red little car, and it's amazing to see it running in that, because I actually had that toy when I was a kid, so that was really cool. I think there's a Switch port now, there's a PS Vita port. I think there's a lot of interesting uses of it. There's ports to various like handheld consoles I've never owned, like the Pandora. I don't really get involved in those ports. I just let other people do it. That's part of the fun of the project. You give the code away and you get to see Outrun running everywhere, and that's kind of the dream. You want Outrun running on every platform in existence.
Yeah. Chris, this has been extremely enlightening, and I'm sure a lot of people out there who are wondering about the intricacies of Outrun and moreover the Cannonball engine can go to bed knowing that they know just a little bit more about how the game works. So thank you very much for coming on the show today, and I hope to talk to you soon.
No worries. Yeah, thanks for having me on your show.